Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. In order to express our thoughts and feelings, we often try to select our words carefully. But what we often miss out on is that our body is already actively communicating what we are thinking. If we are unaware of what our gestures mean, our body language can become our weakness. But if we become aware of how to identify non-verbal cues and how to project certain ideas through our movements, our body language can become a powerful tool. On tonight's show, we discuss how to decode nonverbal communication. We welcome today our guests. Joining us is Ms. Lera Boroditsky, an Associate Professor of Cognitive Sciences at UCSD and Editor-in-Chief of Frontiers in Cultural Psychology. She has been named one of the 25 visionaries changing the world by Utne Reader. She's joining us from San Diego. We're also joined by Mr. Allan Pease, who is a world-renowned and best-selling author on a number of books related to body language that have sold more than 27 million copies. He's globally known as Mr. Body Language. He's joining us from Sydney. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Allan, let me begin with you. Tell us, why is it important, before anything else, to be more cognizant of how our body impacts our mind and those around us?
Well, body language, that is things other than words and speech, account for somewhere between 60 to 80% of the impact of a message when you're face to face with somebody, which we sort of are in this situation with television. And we know that people form up to 90% of their impression about you within the first 4 minutes of meeting. In fact, most of that's in the first 10 seconds, but most of it's done within 4 minutes. We decide whether we're going to give a person encouragement, or we're going to dismiss them, whether we agree with them or whether we don't. Most of that's done on what we would call an intuitive feeling in that first 4 minutes. And if you don't know how you're coming across for someone, or if you're coming across in a negative way, if you don't get the first 4 minutes right, you're going to struggle with getting that person to want to cooperate or say yes to what you might be proposing. Because the thing about leadership and dealing with people face to face, if you can create an atmosphere where people feel comfortable, they're likely to say yes to give you the interview, to give you the job, to give you the nod on the negotiation of the sale, or to go on a date with you.
Right. And here what you're pointing towards is the positive impact that our body language should have. And likability. How can people project likability through their body language?
Well, one of the first things to do is that when you're looking at a person for the first time, the face is usually the focus. And if you look at primate behaviour, monkeys and chimps, we get an idea as to how some of the expression we use can be also used effectively in face-to-face communication with humans. For example, smiling. So one of the things you need to do when you meet any person, we want to create rapport, to create an atmosphere where people feel comfortable and are likely to want to go along with you, or at least give you a fair hearing, is to smile with your teeth visible. Now, the important thing about having the teeth visible, we're one of the only land animals that smiles that doesn't bite or attack next. So if a dog smiles at you, you're in trouble. Right. But if a human being does it, or if a chimpanzee does it, it can be used as a submission signal. It's got two basic meanings, and submission is one of them. And that's why when you meet someone for the first time, if you smile and you bare your teeth, showing your teeth is the important thing. We have herbivore teeth, so they're not intimidating teeth, whereas carnivorous animals have pointed teeth, which can often be used as a warning signal to say that they'll attack you. And in the case of many primates, including us, it becomes a submission signal. So if I meet you and say, hi, nice to meet you, and I do a second thing, which I just did, call an eyebrow flash. So I just raise my eyebrows for a split second, and monkeys and chimps do this as well. It's in fact an eye-widening signal, which says to you, I acknowledge you, I see that you're here, I recognise you. So when I say, hi, nice to meet you, suddenly you'll get a feeling there's something about me you kind of like. You're not really quite sure what it is. You probably can't pinpoint it, but suddenly I'm creating an atmosphere where you're likely to say yes to the interview, to the date, or whatever it is I might be proposing.
Right. And Mr. Allan, hold on to that. I do want to discuss more in this show how unintentional cues that we give off, they cement certain judgments of ourselves in people's minds. But before that, I want to bring Lera into this conversation as well. Lera, before I put my question to you, I just want to show a snippet of your TED Talk.
Now, of course, there isn't just one language in the world. There are about 7,000 languages spoken around the world. And all the languages differ from one another in all kinds of ways. So some languages have different sounds, they have different vocabularies, and they also have different structures, very importantly, different structures. That begs the question, does the language we speak shape the way we think?
Right. So following from this, you're showing us and telling the audience how there are a vast number of languages out there and how they vary in form and their vocabularies. Is body language something much more universal in this sense? Are there universal signs that everyone can understand? And how much do they vary across cultures?
There are definitely some differences. So, for example, and the head signal for no is this. So if you just assumed that it was the same as in America or in Pakistan, you would, of course, interpret things very, very differently, the opposite of what was meant
right.
usually. And, of course, the way we use our hands, the gestures that we make with our hands will also matter depending on the language that we speak. But there are also other things that are easier to interpret. If someone has an open posture, if someone is smiling, that's a pretty good signal that someone means well, that they're open to you. And when we talk to other people, we often will imitate their gestures and their postures, especially if we like them. So if you come to like one, you'll end up nodding your head the same way that they do. You'll end up moving your hands and swaying the same way that they do. And so when you send those signals out to your speaking partner, if you're building rapport, if you're getting along well, you'll notice a lot of joint head nodding, joint foot tapping, joint gestures. It's a good way of seeing just how much you're getting along.
Right, and that's something that they refer to as mirroring, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Right, and that's supposed to get make you more likable to your audience. From there too, I also want to ask you, how do our gestures and our body language impact the way our mood is and our thoughts?
We often take cues from our own bodies about how we're feeling. So anyone can try this now. If you smile, if you give a nice big smile, or you go say ah, you'll feel good for a moment because part of the way that you know how you're feeling is by taking cues from your own body. Now, of course, it'll only work for a little moment, but it is a little bit of a relief. And sometimes we can get ourselves scrunched up, especially if you're working at a computer. You might get your body scrunched up. You might be have your brows furrowed. And if you just unfurrow that, open up your shoulders, take a breath, you can feel good for a moment, and that might spread to people around you. That if you notice, people who make you feel good might often have pleasant expressions on their face, and that can be contagious.
Right, and you're talking about how something can be contagious here, and I want to ask Mr. Pease here, how are signals and our body language cues delivered to other people, and are they intentionally aware of the impact it's having on them?
Well, most people are not aware consciously of what's happening. We get what you might describe as intuitive feelings or gut feelings, as women might describe it. And oftentimes, a lot of that gut feeling, that intuitive feeling, boils down to the fact that we've read the emotional body signals coming from a person. We've then matched it up with what we hear them saying in the circumstances and the context under which it's happening. And that allows you, when you become quite good at this, to be able to figure what could be going on in their mind, because body language in simple terms is an outward reflection of your emotional conditions. So whatever emotion you're feeling is likely to be revealed in a gesture, expression, a posture, or a movement. So the art of reading body language is you're really reading a person's emotions and matching it up with what they say in the circumstances under which they say it. And overall, women collectively are fair to be better at this. Tests show that they're better at understanding emotions than their male counterparts. So, for example, going back some time ago, back in the early 70s, I made a film that I called the Crying Baby Test. It was a very simple film. We took 10-second clips of crying babies, put them all together one reel, and showed men and women this reel with the sound off, and their task was to determine what did this baby want. And most women could decode a range of up to 7 emotions. The baby was hungry, tired, frightened, in pain, wanted his diaper changed, where most men couldn't do that same. In fact, the most common response from men when you asked what the baby wanted, they said it wants its mother. And so they were problem solving as opposed to reading the emotions. So really it's a matter of reading a person's emotional condition, matching up with what they're saying. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be able to do this on an intuitive level, and women are more likely to be in that category overall than men, then you're probably going to be called intuitive or perceptive. If you're no good at it, you're called not perceptive, which means you're not really aware of emotions, and you just continue to talk about what you're talking about and ignore how they're feeling.
Right. And Mr. Pease, often we hear people talking about that someone walked in the room and they don't know why, but they just got a bad feeling about them, and that sticks with them. As you mentioned before, 90% of the perception is cemented in the first 4 minutes. So that lasts with them. But how reliable is this intuition? How reliable is that gut feeling?
Well, if you can get it mostly right with most people most of the time, you'll probably be called a genius, because most people can't do that. You're never going to be 100% on this. And there are people who are in prison, for example, for crimes that they didn't commit, but they look like they might have committed. So therefore, juries are likely to convict them. And there are people who are walking the streets who might have committed crimes who got off because they didn't, in the opinion of the judges or the jury. They didn't look as though they did it. And we tend to make most of our decisions about people based on our gut feeling, even though it's not necessarily always accurate, because we can get it wrong. We can miscue or misread something. And this is one of the dangers of body language, that you never want to take one signal in isolation and say it's got a meaning. So for example, if I said, I always watch your show and I really enjoy it, chances are you wouldn't believe me, but maybe I had an itchy nose, maybe I had bad breath, false teeth, or I had garlic for lunch, who knows? But the point is that at a gut level, you don't trust me right now. You don't know why you don't trust me. And that's one of the miscues, that you have misread what my intentions might have been. It doesn't matter whether I was or wasn't lying. The bottom line is that you don't trust me based on what you think you saw.
Right. And Mr. Allan, you highlight something very, very important there, the flaw in the justice system, in the global justice system, where police officers, and we hear about this often, especially in the United States, where they, on a gut feeling, shoot a person who was unarmed. Ms. Lera, following from that, whatever Mr. Allan has talked about, tell us, is there any way of quantifying body language, or is science any closer to doing that so that it's better integrated when people use it professionally?
Certainly, there's lots of study of gesture and facial expression, and so we have ways of trying to quantify it and measure it. But just as Allan was saying, our intuitive representations of what someone else is thinking or feeling are often really off. So we have these naive theories. So if you see someone crying, they must be sad. But actually, people cry for lots of reasons. You might cry because you're really happy. You might cry because you have bittersweet emotions. You might cry because you've just been chopping onions. There are lots of reasons for why you might have a particular expression on your face. And so I think it's really important to not overvalue those, especially those initial or fast impressions that we make, because people might make certain expressions because they're in pain, not because they wish you harm. There are many different causes for how someone might look.
Right. But something that I do want to get to is how we talk about identifying certain threatening behaviors, how certain aggressive personalities, we should be able to recognize them. Do you think in that case it's safe to say that one should go with their gut feeling? Or are there any behavioral factors that can distinguish someone in a normal setting as being a potential threat or a potential danger?
I think a lot of those judgments people make, not just based on body language, but also about the theory they have of that person. So if you're interacting with someone like me, I'm short, I'm not very muscular. It's very unlikely that you would ever interpret any facial expression for me as a real physical threat, and you would want to do something that's violent to protect yourself. But if I was much taller, if I was of a different ethnic group that you think is violent, that you have a theory is violent, then you would respond to the same set of behaviors as if they were threatening violence. So two different people, depending on how they look, might act exactly the same way, but that action would be received differently. So what you're seeing is not actually what the person is doing at all. What you're seeing is your own theory of what that kind of person acts like. And that could be a real problem, because that means that some people will be treated as being violent or threatening for the same behavior that another person is is never going to be treated
Right,
that way.
right. So there's some preconceived notions that are feeding into how we're judging people, and those preconceived notions attributed to the way we're socialized. Mr. Allan, while we're talking about this and talking about our modern age, we hear so much about how technology has impacted the way we communicate. People just don't communicate in the same intimate manners anymore. Do you think, as an expert, that's something you would agree with, that we have evolved or we have changed how we fundamentally show appreciation or show affection or intimacy?
Well, absolutely. In fact, some of the things that have changed in the last, say, 40 years. When I wrote Body Language, the original book back in the 1970s, I went to 33 different cultures and found, for example, with the OK gesture, there were up to 10 different meanings depending on which culture you went to. So in Japan, for example, this gesture could mean money, whereas in the United States, in fact, the English-speaking countries, generally Western countries, it means OK. In places like France, it can mean 0 as well as OK. So 0, 1 on the thumb, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's how they count. Most of those cultural differences now are disappearing because of American television. Because whichever country you go to, I spent 3 months of the year in Eastern countries, in the Russian-speaking countries. And if you go back 30 years ago, when I first started researching over there, you could film grandparents and then film their kids who are in their, say, 20s and 30s, and then film their grandchildren and have 3 separate films with the sound turned off. And you would get very much the same type of gestural behaviour from all 3 groups. But now it's changed. You'll see something very different, that the younger generation, the millennials especially, almost regardless of culture other than the Middle East, are now showing all American gestures. And the reason for this is interesting, because American television now is virtually everywhere. American video games, which have gestures and behaviours that are largely based on Western cultures and are made by Americans largely, they're being imitated by kids in every country. So about 5 years ago, I made a short film where we filmed kids under the age of 10 in 10 different countries and put them all together on a reel. And the delegates at conferences had to guess, what culture did they belong to. And they generally couldn't do it because the kids were all using the OK gesture, the thumbs up gesture for meaning good, which in some parts of the world is a rude insult. So American television and video games is culturally changing body language. Now, the upside of that, I guess if there's an upside, would be that in generations to come, we'll all be behaving in similar ways. So we'll all be able to be better understand how a person's feeling regardless of their culture. The downside is that cultural differences are disappearing. And it's only countries such as in the Middle East, where I spend some time, that you'll see gestures that have been held there for maybe hundreds of years that they just don't change because they don't let their kids access television like we do in West and in Europe.
Right. But why is it important to retain certain cultural gestures? Why do you see that as being fundamentally important for a society?
Well, it's a matter of how you look at it. It's important from the standpoint if you want to preserve some cultural heritage of any culture. Of course, the other side of it is if you're talking with somebody from the Middle East, for example, which still maintains a fair degree of cultural signals that they have that go back hundreds of years, such as rubbing of the elbow and touching of the heart and touching the eye and the nose, which they have specific meanings. But that if you don't understand that's the difference and you're talking with a person, you'll find it very difficult to work out what they are really thinking or feeling, or you'll find it difficult to know how to assess what's going on. Whereas if we're all using the same basic gestures, the same basic behavioural body language, it's easier to figure out what you think could be going on in a person's mind, unless, of course, they're a professional actor or a professional liar. Now, a professional actor is nothing more than a person who can convince themselves that they are somebody else. And if they really convince themselves that they're another character, they'll show the emotions of that character, and therefore the body signals will largely follow without a lot of training. And if they're good at it, we give them an Oscar.
Right.
If they do that in business, we put them in jail.
And Mr. Allan, hold on to that thought. I do want to show a little video of what you talked about earlier in your TED Talk. Let's have a look at it and continue our discussion.
But if you intentionally use this in situations where you feel intense or nervous, it does 2 things. First is when you intentionally take the gesture as you just did, you start to feel more confident, in charge. In charge of my emotions. Importantly, the person who sees you do it, it's a feeling. You seem to know what you're about. You know what it was? When I first met that guy or that woman, they just seem to have a confident attitude. Well, no, they're probably intentionally doing things to create that, to reassure themselves and to make you feel good. Fake it until you make it.
So that was Mr. Allan Pease giving a TED Talk here. Mr. Pease, so now the takeaway from me there is fake it till you make it. And you're talking about how you can use certain signals, certain body gestures to make yourself believe you're something. Now, following from the discussion we were having, you were talking about how professional actors can somehow change or manipulate their body signals. But do you think the common man, an ordinary person, can do that too, to make themselves feel better and to have a more positive impact on other people?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a very simple way of testing this is to get up in the morning, whatever time you get out of bed, let's say at 6 o'clock, and stand in front of a mirror and look at yourself and laugh as hard as you can go for 60 seconds. You've only got to do this for 60 seconds. Laugh as hard as you can go. You've got to warn other family members if you're going to do this, otherwise they might think you've lost the plot. Now, after 60 seconds, your brain doesn't know that you're not happy and excited. It responds to the gesture. So therefore, it starts to pump endorphin into your blood system. And all of a sudden, you feel the excitement that you have acted out for the last 60 seconds. And with most gestures and behaviours, you can do that because body language, as I mentioned earlier, is an outward reflection of your emotional condition. It shows what you're likely to be feeling. By intentionally mirroring and doing the gestures and carrying the gestures out and laughing and smiling at yourself is one of these examples, you can create a situation where you actually feel the emotion, so you can manipulate your own emotions, which is very handy if you've got to go, for example, for a job interview where you might be nervous or even terrified, and you're likely to have gestures, expressions and movements that show lack of confidence, where a HR manager might be looking for somebody who is feeling confident. So by intentionally manipulating your own body language for a few minutes before you go in, using such as the steeple gesture that I just demonstrated on that
right.
film, and by using eyebrow flashing and smiling, by manipulating your own, you do two things. First, you make yourself feel better and more confident. And importantly, when people meet you, they feel better about you. They feel that you are more confident, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, that you actually create the condition that you want. Whereas if you go in being nervous, which is what many people will do, you also create a nervous situation because the gestures you've got now are there because you've learnt them all your life. And many of these things you can unlearn and replace them with things that will serve you better rather than take away from your performance.
Right. And you have told us and given us important insights on how we can bring about positive impacts in our environment and within ourselves with just these few tricks. But Ms. Lera, on that note, I do want to also talk about some negative body gestures that people have. In this age, while we were talking about technology impacting our relations and how we communicate, there is also an evident rise in depression. And one of the main things that we hear about is that we just couldn't tell that that person was depressed or that person was going through something. Now, is there something that society and people around an individual who is depressed or is struggling with something can keep an eye out for so they are more aware of what that person might be going through?
Verbal language communicates a whole lot of structured information. That's the reason that you and I have been using language to talk this whole time as opposed to just making gestures at each other, right? You can get a lot of information. So obviously talking to someone is a really good one. But also looking at real world behaviors, like how is that person sleeping? Are they eating? Are they losing weight or gaining weight? Depression can manifest in the body, in sleep disturbances, in really drastic changes in weight. And whenever you notice that about a loved one, you want to find out why. It might not be depression, there might be other causes. But usually when there are these really rapid changes in someone's physical appearance and their behavioral patterns, you want to get in touch with them and talk to them about how they're feeling.
Right. And that's something that people should look out for. Mr. Allan, is there anything more you would want to add to that?
Well, the interesting thing about people who are in a state of depression or they're closed off mentally, they're likely to be displaying closed off signals. And some of the common things you might see are constantly having their arms, legs crossed and leaning away from you as opposed to towards you. We lean towards people when we feel positive and enthusiastic and we like that person. We lean away from people and situations that we don't feel comfortable with. And if somebody's always been showing negative behaviour, such as arms crossed, sitting back, doesn't mean that they're depressed. But if they suddenly start displaying those behaviours, which isn't part of their normal pattern, that gives you a clue that there's an emotional change taking place, which is reflected in the emotions of the body language and how they look.
Right there. And I understand that, and that's something that would be useful for people to remember while they're trying to observe people around them. On a different note there, Mr. Allan, you work a lot with power and submission and concepts related to that. Something that I'm sure a lot of the viewers would like to understand is you observing powerful people, powerful personalities, CEOs, world leaders throughout. What are some of the most common traits in terms of their body language that you have observed and that people could perhaps mimic until they actually integrate that within themselves?
For them and say, yes, if we get a feeling that they can do the job, even though maybe their CV may not stack up to show it's what they need to have. But if we get a feeling that they can do it, then we're likely to give them the vote. And when somebody walks into a room, sometimes you just notice that person. And you don't know what it is about them, but everybody notices that person. And somebody who was an expert at this, and I saw this man do this several times, was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton would walk into a room and suddenly everybody noticed the guy. And the same thing happened with Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan, when he landed at the White House, when he got out of his helicopter and walked towards the White House, he walked in a semi-march. Now, that's an intentional gesture, an intentional move. Australian Prime Ministers, you'll notice in the past, have done the same sort of thing. It's an intentional march because people who walk in a half march, you can't quite consciously see they're doing it, but there's something about them that's different. They're intensely marching, which therefore we give them power points. We decide they must have some sort of authority about them. When they stand at a lectern, you can get simple things, for example, like the taller a person is perceived to be, the more power we think they've probably got. Now, on television, people are only this tall. They're only very short on TV, so we don't really know how tall they are. We decide how tall or short they might be based on the presentation. And so that being the case and understanding that, if you're going to film a CEO or you're going to film a politician who wants to come across as powerful and give them height, you drop the camera down low and you film them up so that they appear to be taller. On the other hand, if somebody's shorter, that's something you certainly want to do to make somebody look and appear more powerful. Because if they're debating against somebody who's taller, we will instinctively give more power credibility to the taller person than the shorter person, which is certainly not politically correct, but that's what actually happens.
Right. And Ms. Lera, we're talking about something that Mr. Allan mentioned here as well, that powerful people, there is a certain attraction. People are drawn towards them. Now, everyone does want to be liked. And there's also another question that most people ask is, how do they know if someone's attracted to them or if they're being liked by a general group of people? Scientifically and the way we communicate verbally as well as non-verbally, just give us an idea of how people can decode certain signals.
I think we naturally have a lot of intuitions about whether people like us or not. So if you're talking to someone and the person is smiling and nodding along, they seem to be following what you're saying. You can see in their eyes that they understand what you're saying. Those are really good signs. I think often we choose to ignore those signs. So you might want someone to like you, even if they're giving you the cold shoulder, they're brushing you off, but you kind of want to push past it and say, I'm going to make this person like you. So I would say that just being more mindful, both about the signals that other people are sending you, but also about the signals that you are sending yourself. Even if you just start paying attention a little bit more about how you move your body and how other people move their body, you might prevent yourself from sending unintended signals. And you might be able to put out more of that positive energy, that calm, relaxed energy that people like into the world. That changes the way people respond to you as well.
Right. And thank you so much, Ms. Lera Boroditsky. And we're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to talk a little more about how people can identify liars and people who are trying to deceive them. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Let's take our discussion forward and talk about how body language can give away lies and guilt. Joining us for this segment now is Mr. Marko Burazor, who's a nonverbal communication expert. He's joining us from Serbia. And we're still continuing with our guest here, Mr. Allan Pease, who is joining us from Sydney. Mr. Marko, thank you so much for joining us. Now, before you joined us, we were talking a little about how you should interpret guilt and how you shouldn't always completely rely on your gut feeling while doing so, because that can also create some misjudgment there. But give us a sense of how universal the signs of lying are and whether there is any sure-shot way of telling if a person is lying to you.
Usually, lying I recognize very easily because people tend to avoid the gaze through me, and they don't want to look you in the eye during those first 5 seconds of pronouncing those lie. Of course, we always need to be aware of situation that people are maybe nervous, they have very hard day, but for lie, I always try to see as much as possible signs, some cues which are they're nervous, they tend to move their leg, the hands are moving in those times. If they're maybe actor, they are maybe better because they're all roles, their lies. They're more pretending in their acting to be better liars. So with them, it's a little bit harder. And then I try to catch up some vocal signs, which they are not consistent with what they said before.
Right.
So usually for lie, and for me, always helpful to see if someone is scratching the nose or putting the hand across the mouth. So always something like that.
Right. Mr. Allan, I want to talk a little about the book, Why Men Lie and Why Women Cry. Unpack this for us a little, and if you could just tell us about the gender differences between nonverbal communication, especially when it comes to lying and perhaps being deceitful, and something that would be knowledgeable for our audience here.
Well, one of the interesting things that we found in that book, in researching it, was that when it comes to lying, if you ask men and women collectively everywhere, who lies the most? Do men lie more or do women lie more? Women will collectively say, well, yeah, men lie more. Men generally aren't sure of the answer, but what the research shows is that women lie roughly the same amount as men. Women think men lie more because men aren't very good at getting away with it. Women are good at reading it. Men aren't good at putting it across. So it gives the illusion, if you like, that men are lying constantly, but in fact they're not. They're lying. We lie about the equal amount. What we discovered is that when it comes to lying, we lie at least once every 7 minutes. It's a social lie, not necessarily a manipulative lie to get a benefit. But if someone said, how do you like my hairstyle? Rather than saying, well, you look like a sack full of cats heading for the river, you might say, oh, look, it really looks good, it suits you. And in fact, that is a lie. And we do that to defend us, to protect the social relationship we might have with someone. But when it comes to lying, men and women lie about the same. But women collectively worldwide think men lie much more because men get caught more often because women are better at it.
So what makes women better liars and men poor liars? What is it that allow men to get caught more often?
Well, it appears to be several things. And one of the most significant is the parts of the brain that are set up in women's brains to read the emotions of other people and animals. And this appears to be an evolutionary adaptation. In other words, that your ancestors, your ancient mothers, needed to be able to look at anybody approaching where they had babies and be able to work out from the distance, will that person be friendly or aggressive? They couldn't listen to what they said because if they wait until they're too close, they might be killed. And if they couldn't do that, eventually, statistically, they would be killed. So they needed to know, will that person be my friend? Will they be my enemy? If an animal's approaching, women needed to be able to look at the animal and say, well, that animal will be friendly or aggressive. Now, that was never an issue for men. If some guy's approaching your cave, if you're not sure about him, you just hit him with the big rock or a stick. You don't go and negotiate it or hide. And that seems to be one big difference. And women have parts of the brains for decoding the body language of babies. That is it hungry, frightened, tired, injured, and in pain, that men don't seem to have the same natural ability to do that, because in evolutionary terms, we never needed to be able to figure out what's a baby feeling. When we're out hunting bison, throwing rocks at it, we're not saying, I wonder how it's feeling about all this. We just want to accurately hit it. And that appears to be the theory that works the best in terms of why women are better at reading it. It's also why most men know that lying to women to their face is not an easy thing, especially if she knows you. We tell men, don't lie to women to their face. You're better to make a phone call or SMS.
Right. And that definitely sheds a lot of light onto what the evolutionary process behind is why men act differently to women. Mr. Marko, going back to you and talking a little more about our body language and gestures, tell us about how important it is to create positive nonverbal communication skills, and what does nonverbal communication fluency mean in this regard? What is the positive standard, if there is any, to reach for people?
As my understanding, usually there are frequent statement that usually positive people has much more success in work, in interviews, in everyday life, and that then the people with negative posture, with negative body language signs. So in order to be more successful, we need to be more positive. When you want to hug someone, you cannot have a closed posture or something like that, because it's not normal to hug someone with a closed body language. So what I work also as a business consultant, and I saw a lot of things with my clients which are very powerful and rich people, that usually most of them has open posture, positive body language, and they are more perceptive to see how other people think without they say anything to them.
Right, they're more perceptive in that regard. Mr. Allan, when we're talking about leadership styles, which one do you think works best? Because it's often assumed to be a leader, there needs to be some underlying aggression to what you're saying. That aggression depicts passion. But then on the other hand, we also hear that a leader who merges and gels with the team is better able to motivate them. What do you think works better in this regard?
Well, when you look at leadership styles, if you look at, in evolutionary terms, again, at our past generations, leadership has almost entirely been that by men. It's been a testosterone business, and it's a man in front with the flag saying, follow me or die. And that system now has pretty much died out in modern society. Now we have more of a female-type leadership role that's more acceptable. And a female role is the coach. So the leader now is the coach of all the people, makes them feel important, makes them feel special, and gets the team to run along, and the coach probably runs behind them as opposed to running in front. So that's a very female type style, which it's more popular now.
Right, but it seems like when we talk about female leaders, they get a lot of heat for their body language, especially if they're trying to adopt certain male traits within them. Let's just take Hillary Clinton, for example. She gets a lot of heat for some of the stuff she does. And Donald Trump, well, we give him a pass for almost everything here. Do you think that men and women, and this is a value judgment, but I'd like your take on it, that they should stick to some of the innate gestures, body language traits that they have? Or do you think it doesn't make sense to categorize people in that way anymore?
You know, it's interesting the way the leadership's changed. When you look at female leaders, it's a tricky thing for females in leadership, because on the one hand, you expect that as a leader to have high testosterone type behaviours, that is to be able to drive, to put home your point, to get people to follow you. At the same time, you've got to maintain the fact that you're not a pretend man, that you still are a woman. And that becomes a tricky thing to do. Whereas for men, high testosterone men who are out there saying, follow me or else, they've become a dying breed, and they've pretty much disappeared. And now we expect them to also be able to have their feminine side and to cry occasionally when necessary. And very skilled politicians will do that. I know politicians who can cry on demand when necessary to make a good point. And they're not much different to professional actors, because most senior politicians today, I find, in most places, are more like actors now than politicians. They're acting out the role of what they expect the voters to see, to vote for them. Because a politician, if they were to represent the party policy, and if they don't believe in that party policy, we're likely now to be able to see through that, because people are far more versed today in reading body language and are far more aware of it, the fact that you can read people's attitudes through communication. And so I find a lot of seminars that I do worldwide, we get a lot of politicians will come, often in cloak and dagger. They don't want to be seen to be coming to a conference like that where you're learning how to project yourself better and to be more convincing and to cry on demand, which is what a professional actor does.
Right. And Mr. Marko, on that note of politicians and talking about how the political climate is changing, how do you think and how important do you think it is for world leaders and people who are especially fighting elections to create an eccentric personality for themselves through their hand gestures or through their body language? I mean, that gets talked a lot about, and especially when it comes to populist leaders. We have Narendra Modi as an example, who is infamous for his hugs when he goes out for diplomatic missions. Now tell us, in order for images and identities to stick in people's minds, how important is it to develop a sort of body language through your gestures?
The most important people, and like in marketing, they tend to be recognizable. They need to have something which their voters will recognize them. Someone will be recognized by some handshake, like we saw Mr. Trump with handshake where he pulled his opposite side with handshake. So we have other leaders that we saw, Obama with his calm gas, with using a lot of okay, and every politician has his own way. And we have in this life, we have realities everywhere on the world, and people try to be much more eccentric in order to get more followers, more marketing, more previews, more views, everything. Everything
so what would be the marketable traits here? Like, you're talking about how they market themselves better. What would be some of the marketable traits? The more wackier, the better?
I think that's my opinion. It's not anywhere in the books. People need to be in continuous constant. If they have something, they need to be always on that level. Not today you're making the brilliant food, and tomorrow that same food don't taste at all. So if you are making lunch, every day make great lunch. If you are making impression to others, you need to be on the high level always.
Right.
Not to go too much up, not to go too much down.
Right. And Mr. Allan, I'll put my last question to you before we end the show. We're talking about political identities being created by these gestures. How much of a political personality is manufactured, and how much focus is there on body language while these politicians and these world leaders are behind the curtains?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. And if you go back, say, 30 to 40 years, the person that you would see as a leader presenting themselves in the media or on stage is more likely to be that person showing their real emotions. But now they know that they're in showbiz, as I mentioned earlier, that we vote for people that we feel confident look like they can do the job. And a good example of this was Angela Merkel in Germany. I saw her a few times in Europe when I was in conferences where she'd be opening a conference. And the first time I saw her, I noticed her behind stage when she was just elected as Chancellor of Germany, and she had notes, and she was reading her notes, and she was pacing up and down behind the curtain, clearly showing stress. And it's something I learned that I found quite surprising, that she was nervous in front of a large crowd. And if you're nervous in front of a large crowd, they're likely to pick it up and therefore not feel the confidence in you. So she developed the gesture, which is one that we talked about earlier, this thing called the steeple. It's almost like a form of praying. That occurs naturally in about 1 of 10 people. And the word that goes with this is confidence. If you're feeling confident about what you're seeing, feeling, experiencing, this is a gesture that you may see. But if you intentionally do this, and if you do this right now, just put your fingers together like that and just move them back slowly like that and put a little smile on your face, suddenly you'll feel like you're confident you can get away with something sneaky. And so you have created your atmosphere, your attitude by taking the gesture. And this is what Angela Merkel did. And whenever you would see her come out, she would come out and she would intensely take a steeple, which did two things. One, it made her feel better about herself and her confidence. And importantly, when we saw her, we'd say, wow, well, here's the most powerful woman in the world. She looks like she knows what she's doing, but she overused the gesture. And in Germany, the comedians and the comics started to really give her a hard time.
Wow.
Hello, I'm Angela Merkel. Hello, how are you? And they started to take the mickey out of her, as we'd say. And so therefore she had to reduce that and replace it because she overused it and became too obvious. Whereas Donald Trump has got his double okay gesture, which in fact isn't okay. When he says, you've got to trust me and trust the system, what he's really using what's called an air pinch. That is, it's going to be perfect. It's absolutely perfect. But to most people, it looks like he's saying it's going to be double okay. So it's a misinterpretation by us of what he's doing. So he needs to change that. Now, I don't know who trains Donald Trump. The first year of his presidency, I'd say nobody did because he really screwed things up from a body language perspective. But he's certainly changed things now. He's giving palm-up handshakes rather than dominating on top. But he's still got the double okay gesture, which in places like Turkey and Greece is a sexual insult. It tells them that they're a rude part of your body.
Right. And this definitely reminds me of how you said, fake it till you make it. Be subtle about it there in the case of Angela Merkel. Mr. Marko, last question to you. Now, Mr. Allan showed us one of his power moves to show confidence and at least feel more confident. Is there any tricks you'd like to share with our viewers?
I like to use. I think I read in Mr. Allan's book, Barbara and Allan's book, with thumbs up, and I usually using that during my press interviews, my TV shows, because it relaxes me, and in the same way I communicate to other side that I'm controlling the situation. I will. Everything will be okay, but with thumbs up. So for me, I using steeple also sometimes, but not to be that much visible. But thumbs up, I preferred more.
Right. And thank you so much, Mr. Marko Burazor, for joining us. Thank you so much, Mr. Allan Pease, for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you, gentlemen. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.